So we're 2 minutes past, and it looks like we had a couple of more folks actually join. So why don't we go ahead and get started? As we have done in the last couple of days, we just want to highlight the number to have handy for tech support during this workshop. So you see that number 478-321-6004, and that text, it works better in order to receive some technical assistance if the Zoom or some other technical aspect starts going a little bit wonky for you. Folks are here monitoring, and so they can also be responsive to messages if you need to actually send that. Thanks for joining us for day 3 of this workshop that's been spread out across several days. We are thankful that you are hanging in with us. And because this is Molly's and my first time offering this workshop in this particular format, split over sort of 3 different sessions, would love to hear your feedback. We appreciate that you all are thinking about educational design and those sorts of things in particular, and so would appreciate any feedback that you have for us if you have any things for us to think about. What we are going to do today is to do some review of our concepts, because there are some folks who are joining who haven't necessarily gotten all of the sort of baseline framework and content. We'll do that really quickly, and then we'll work on a case study again together with a slightly different framework before working on some action planning, and then hopefully having some rich discussion around that. So we'll start with the review, quick review, and you see on the slide there. We want to just again remind folks that we're working with a particular definition of intercultural competence, and that's the capability to shift perspective and adapt behavior, so both perspective and behavior, to cultural differences and commonality in a way that is appropriate and authentic. And so that's the definition that we're using. And just a quick reminder too, that doesn't specify what cultures we're working with. Doesn't specify that it's just about racial ethnic culture or about generational culture, but it's really about all the different cultures that are present among us, and that's actually the differences and commonalities that we're looking for. And within that, then we also talked about priming as a way that our brains work, right? That there are ways that our brains are receiving messages constantly, whether that's from media, families, just society in general. And this is a way for our brains to process information really quickly. But sometimes those primes then can help help us actually make really quick assumptions and decisions that are harmful to community and kingdom building. And that one of the pieces then that we're trying to identify are choice points where folks can actually exercise agency and power within a process and a system in a positive way, so that and we can stop and make different choices than the automatically programmed ones. And that the way to actually do that in those moments is sometimes to have equity primes that will prime our brains for equity, and not the automatic assumptions that lead to repeated patterns of sometimes harmful behavior or othering or breaking behavior. And so those are the things that we're talking about. Molly, you want to take us through that, the othering and belonging orientations?
Sorry for being muted. This is a framework that we offered yesterday as a kind of explainer of kind of orientation toward difference, but also kind of an approach. So in othering, it's classifying everything, every person and group, into kind of me and not me, which then translates into an us-them orientation, which will always create a hierarchical kind of understanding of valuing me over anything that's not me. There's win-lose stakes. Cultural engagement is going to be seen as competition or subtraction. There's something to lose in engagement if I can even see that there is difference, right? If we go to the mindsets, there is a denial orientation that just I am all persons, right? And then the breaking behaviors are kind of the seeking distinction, division, and individuation, right? It's ways of denying connection. Belonging orientation and its behaviors are in fact a kind of me, seeing me as me in a system of other me's who are not like me. So it becomes the goal of connecting and understanding, a we orientation for purpose to engagement. So it's addition mindset, humility with regard to power. It can be hierarchical, but it may also be egalitarian or in another kind of power approach. And bridging behaviors are behaviors that seek connection, community, solidarity, and are based in kind of mutual respect. So I am worthy of respect, and so are all the other me's that I encounter. I need to issue an apology. One of the links that we highlighted yesterday was not working. And while the primary link that got you to the landing page worked, but the link to the 7-day cleanse is not working anymore. So these are 2 links for 21-day equity challenges, which have a similar kind of function on how one brings from unconscious to conscious and how one can alleviate the negative effects of biases. These 2 are good examples of those kinds of things. And as we were ending our time yesterday, in the chat, it was requested to link to Gregory Bentley's, the co-moderator of GA224, an explainer of his kind of approach to ministry in the 6 R's. And so this article does that, and his R's are remembrance, remorse, repentance, repair, reconciliation, and resurrection. And you might already hear echoes in the kind of content that we are providing, that kind of choice point, identifying one's power and orienting oneself to community and mutual engagement that acknowledges that all parties are worthy of full dignity and connection. So those are 2 corrections.
Thanks, Molly. And we also want to bring everyone back to the intercultural development continuum that we presented on the first day, that there is a continuum of with appropriate developmental tasks and developmental a mindset that actually helps us to think about what folks are able to do at various stages, actions they're able to take, shifts that they're able to make in terms of perspective, those sorts of pieces, because really this intercultural competence is a skill that we develop over time and with intentionality. And so it's not something that we're innately born with, and our brains are not primed for that. We're often not socialized for that. And so it's helpful to have this continuum in mind, that there is this continuum from monocultural mindsets through transitional mindsets of minimization, through to the other side into intercultural mindsets. And so yesterday, we spent some time working on a case study at the end of our time, thinking through a case study and identifying choice points around decision-making and planning and those sorts of pieces there. Today, in particular, we'd like to take a brief look as we sort of dive back into this content on the case study there on the screen, and I'll just highlight those for folks so that you can also hear it and in addition to reading it, in order that we might actually spend some time in this case study identifying choice points around even developmental continuum type issues as well. And so the case study here is a leadership team that would like to engage in either church or presbytery-wide training on racial equity and inclusion. So this is moving away from sort of general culture work, but specifically on racial equity and inclusion in this time. This is the first time that these conversations have been planned for such a wide audience for the entire congregation or the presbytery. And the church or the presbytery is theologically, socially, and politically diverse. And so would love to hear from you all as you're looking at this case study, what some choice points may be and what some primes, whereas we begin to shift not just in identifying choice points, but what some primes might be to help us actually ask different questions might be. So I'll leave that there and ask that as you have things to say, either unmute and speak or feel free to raise your hand, and we can also call on folks if that feels more comfortable. So what are the choice points and the equity primes that you see here?
Well, this is Sarah, and I'll speak. I would like to, excuse me, hope that the leadership team is also representative of the diversity in the diversities that you've outlined that are in the presbytery.
Thanks, Sarah. We always sometimes, or there often we think about diversity issues as after we've actually done some of the planning instead of thinking all the way back in terms of how the team is formed. And so that's definitely a choice point. Thank you.
Question I would ask about the diversity of the team. In the case study, we identified theological, social, and political difference. But if we are thinking about the mindsets, it may be helpful to be as inclusive as one can be in the kind of intercultural capacity spots and interpretations as well, because you're attempting to lead, guide a very diverse crew, right? The predictions would be, there's a bell curve that comes out and there's some predictions one can make.
Right, and you don't want to sabotage it out of the gate.
Yeah.
This is Marie, and I was absent to the other two, well, to the first one, and then I got a little bit of the second one. So if I'm wrong on certain things or ways of communicating the correct language, so please excuse me. But if I understood what choice points were, and thinking about the leadership team to engage in that particular study, if we're thinking about including intercultural capacity as well, that includes languages, and that has something that has been on my mind for a long time. If you're going to engage in conversations with different cultures, consider that there might need a interpretation, might be needed, translation of the materials. This is just in the planning stages. In order to plan and to be inclusive in that planning team, and you want to include different perspectives and nationalities and cultural diversity, then it also has to include that that interpretation, translation of materials right off the bat. Also including if closed caption is needed, if interpretation to sign language is needed, if we actually want to include different constituencies, so to speak, in that leadership team. So that's not even planning the event or planning the course. It's just getting that team to be ironclad if we're talking about racial equity and inclusion.
Can I just ask a question? So this is actually something that we're going to be trying to do. We have a leadership team established that created a statement on racial injustice for the presbytery. And we developed sort of a plan of action. And one of the things that we would like to do is bring this type of training in. So the training, the team that created the statement is very diverse in terms of race. I'm not sure how varied we are in a lot of the theological and maybe political. So my question is, I'll get to the question, because we do have the whole span of folks in our presbytery. And in fact, you know, when we put out the statement, we received some comments from some folks. So how can you go about trying to reach out to those who might be closer to the monocultural mindset, because I think we do have folks who are in that situation, and we'd like to have them involved, but I don't know if their inclination would be to be involved with us. So I'm hoping that you're going to offer us some tips on how that might happen.
Thanks, Cheryl. Are there some ideas or questions that folks sort of hearing that have? I imagine that many folks are actually in similar situations where there's such a diversity within the mix of presbyteries in particular, that planning often happens around those who are willing, and the folks who are not willing, right? It's well, I guess we have to really focus on the sort of the folks who are willing to show up, but how do we actually bring along folks who may be less willing because they feel like it's such a politically divisive thing or something they don't even recognize as being an important issue to really deal with?
One of the things that comes to mind is, where are all the places that and I say these people, the folks that you're identifying, certainly that are most resistant, where do they learn? Are they learning because they sit in worship? So is there an opportunity to not just preach, but teach across the pulpit? Are they learning in small groups or in Sunday school classes? Are they learning during opportunities to fellowship or in mission opportunities? There's a plethora of spaces and places other than doing a book study or taking a class or having a speaker kind of blow in, blow up, and blow out and say, okay, we did that, and the box is checked on a list. And that also speaks to the idea that it can't, I don't know that having sort of a one and done approach is as effective as being strategic and looking at how are all the ways you can reach and teach and give people an opportunity to share and engage. I could be wrong, but there's a tendency that, oh, we'll invite someone or we'll invite that church to come. But are we going? And are we creating opportunities to interact and engage and serve with folks whose, yes, their theologies and their spirituality may be different, in an effort to better understand?
Thanks, Anita, for that. That there is a choice point there in terms of considering what we consider presbytery-wide events, even, right? That we often think of these all come into a common place, but is there a place for using the things that are already going on in individual churches in order to do some of that presbytery-wide initiative? Could pulpit exchange type things actually feed into some of that educational pieces? Are there particular sort of resources that one uses in order to do education in the Bible study setting? Those sorts of pieces, right? So, and even the studies that get chosen, are they developmentally appropriate to where folks are along that continuum, so that folks who are wanting to take more action might use a different curriculum versus folks who are actually just beginning their exploration of difference and commonalities would actually use another sort of curriculum, perhaps, or that gets resourced by the presbytery. So there are lots of different choices there. Thanks for that. Other pieces that you folks are seeing, either as ideas and choice points and primes that folks are identifying in this situation?
Well, even to have the leadership team undergo its own study training as part of the preparation. What I also think I heard in some of Danita's suggestions was that you also amplified, Jihan, was phased approaches. And the strategy and the what you want for the long view and how are you going to get there. But if the leadership team has not done that, maybe you've chosen people who have good intercultural competencies and all of those kinds of things, but 9 times out of 10 that may not be the case, and going through something together that they want others to do is a good leadership step.
Thanks.
I have a question on this, hearing Cheryl's question and how it's been going. Back to the monocultural mindset. How do we work to approach the culture that has grown up with it? Being a mid-council leader in the South is a different culture that they're going to stay monocultural because they have for generations, and trying to make that break. No matter, even if it's and they, many times what we have heard already in trying to do some cultural work is, why are you doing this and not looking at us? If we try to go, this is for this group of people, and we're still working with the culture, but they see it, if it's called a presbytery event, that everybody should have a place at the table. So how do you, that cultural piece is very important as you plan.
Thanks for that, Olivia. And one of the questions I do have, that I wonder about is, are folks recognizing the cultural differences even within communities that they might see as being monocultural and, right, this sort of a monolithic, right, or homogeneous? And I don't know if that's always really true. So I'm thinking back to a comment that Sarah made earlier, like in one of our earlier sessions, that her community, while racially homogeneous perhaps, or mostly the same, that there's actually a community around addiction recovery and addiction issues and those sorts of things that actually is a separate culture that sort of resides there. There are also folks that may be experiencing generational differences. There may be socioeconomic differences too. And one of the things that I think Molly and I have talked about in our work really is that sometimes the critique can be that when we use the language of intercultural competence, that some folks feel like this is our way of soft pedaling racial equity. But we feel like this is a way of complexifying the conversation to say, the more we practice seeing difference and commonality and not assuming sort of homogeneous makeup of our communities, and to begin to be able to have compassion, understanding of folks with whom we have difference instead of suppressing or trying to get rid of those differences, that then as we approach other communities with more visible differences or more differences that are harder to bridge, that we might actually bring with it a mindset that is more open and willing to engage. And so this is a way, I think, for us to say racial equity absolutely is important. And there's also a lot of cultural differences that I think our communities often assume. And, when we can sort of talk about congregations, for example, who might say, no, we're super welcoming. Everybody who joins us says we're super welcoming, but there are lots of folks who don't join that congregation, and it tends to be folks who are a lot like folks who are already in that congregation who tend to join. And there's a lack of recognition that perhaps within the community surrounding it, there's other difference that's not being addressed, not being welcomed, not being even in a sort of a homogeneous congregation. And so what would it look like for folks to be able to notice the differences that are already present in their communities without having to look elsewhere? What would it look like for folks to be able to really think about cultural competence, not just as a racial piece, but as all the other pieces that are around them? Is that a way to address some of the pieces there? Because most congregations are talking about how do we get new people into the congregation? How do we get some of our neighbors there? How do we get younger people? And maybe there's a way to sort of talk about that.
So Danita's point was really good. It triggered a thought in my mind that maybe the question is, who is it that we are intending to draw to the presbytery event? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's the pastor or part of the mission team or whoever that does have a heart for this and would be much more likely to come to a presbytery setting, whereas someone else within a congregation might be more willing to embrace it within their own congregation as opposed to putting themselves out in a presbytery. So maybe the who we are, and I hate the word targeting, but that's basically who are we targeting for the training, and is the intent more to draw people in who can then take it back to their congregation and facilitate that within their own congregation.
I love that, Cheryl. It's a question about sort of multiplicative effort, right? Versus we try to do sort of additive effort on our own. And Dana, thanks for that suggestion. Other pieces that are coming up for you in terms of this case study, developmental continuum type things?
I think this might be farther along the road, but when we talk about cultural competence and going into places that we have not gone before, there's a lot of undiscovered trauma. So when thinking about something like this, there are pastoral and psychological or emotional needs to be aware of. Having people that are trained in specific, trauma areas, pastoral areas that might need to be addressed, and understanding that even I love the idea that Sarah shared on, training the leadership team, and many things can come out of that training, and understanding that there might be a timeline, but not to be defined by that timeline. Because as using my own experience as participating in cultural sensitivity trainings, there are a lot of things that arise coming from my own background and understanding of who I am as a Puerto Rican, as a Latino, and a Hispanic person. And microaggressions, and mixed with imposter syndrome, which is super strange in my mind. And those kinds of things, one doesn't realize it necessarily in the moment. They come later. So as you're prepping that leadership team, there should also be a component of emotional and pastoral support that will be needed, not only for the team, but also for the training itself. I remember taking a cultural sensitivity training in the Presbyterian Center, I think 3 years ago. I think it was in 2018 or something. I think it was my first PMA meeting. And somebody saying, you know what, I feel so uncomfortable. The person just stood up and left. Right in the middle of the training. And then I saw him afterwards with all this, there's a lot of grief tied to this kind of conversation. So to take that into consideration when planning something like this as well.
Thanks, Phil Marie. Yeah, so are we planning for some of the other things that come along with this work instead of just the sort of educational formational pieces? And also, I think, as you suggested, Ville-Marie, that there is a choice point that we get to every single time when we have a timeline. Whenever we sort of come to a place of whether we are going to stick with the timeline or be able to flex and go a different way, that's a choice point, right? And I think so often our automatic choices is to sort of push on ahead with the timeline because we want to sort of keep moving, but those are choice points that suggest themselves along the way as we engage in the process.
Yeah, one of my first questions when I look at this case study is, if the focus is to engage the church and presbytery wide, then that takes precedence over a specific training and a specific topic. If my goal is the bigger we, the kingdom, the being seen and known and acknowledged in our fullness to one another, then how, you know, all the other hows and whys get to flex if the purpose is wanting to engage more deeply. Right? There are steps before you start thinking about speakers and locations and formats and things. And the flexibility of presbytery-wide engagement not necessarily looking alike at all or having the same learning points in all the places. What, you know, how do we recognize what engagement is? How do we allow for engagement to flex to the specific capacities and orientations and locations of all of the folks for whom we aspirationally want to draw into a we, right? Because it's not we're supposed to not indulge our colonial wish to conquer anymore. And so there's a lot of stuff that you gotta kind of get through. An elder in the congregation in which I worship did a moment they called them an E-minute 10 years ago. This is an evangelism piece where the elder is reflecting back to the congregation an appreciation for what mission and ministry in this place is and what it means. And his metaphor has stuck with me for all time for this reason. He described what we do on a Sunday and in our congregation as being a swim team that is working on its skills in the safety of a swimming pool, and drills and practicing the capacities to breathe longer and to swim further and to, tag team and do all of those things. But that place of practice for those skills and those capacities
Molly, you are muted. Suddenly you became muted.
I'm so sorry. I don't know. The thing was working. The keyboard shortcut was working for a minute, and now it doesn't. So we'll do it again. So the purpose of this metaphor is that for him, the congregation is the purpose. The following Jesus is swimming. And the purpose of the congregation is a contained pool where we can care for the qualities of life-giving aspects of the water here, and we can practice our skills and our physical capacities and our group capacities. But the point of being here on Sunday and being in this space is that we are also able to go and swim in a variety of waters, to practice in the lake and the river and the ocean, and use those skills and capacities we've grown in order to engage in other waters and with other folks, right? And the metaphor is we always, even when we're swimming in the ocean, it is healthy for us to keep practicing in the pool, right? There's a protection from all the other things, right, to keep practicing, but you also don't stop trying to swim in these where conditions are less contained. And that metaphor has helped me in so many ways to kind of understand what the smaller subset work might be and the grander goal of building toward the capacities to follow Jesus into waters that are not prescribed or controlled by a group of people that I happen to trust and be in community with, right? Like my goal is to also risk. And so I build capacity. We don't send our weakest swimmers out into the world and say, you can do the same. You can do the same as our Olympian, but we also we make space for there to be swim lessons for no matter, learning how to float is important. And some folks, the fear is so high that learning how to float is right. And you don't belittle someone who's having trouble floating for not wanting to get into the ocean. And so again, these metaphors kind of flex with the capacities and the skills, but also kind of, we're here, but we're also in this greater piece, right? The living water takes us beyond this contained chlorinated space. And there's a time for contained chlorinated space, and there is a time to recognize that that is not also all water. And these kind of ways we can do that. So anyway, again, that's a metaphor that he offered that has stuck with me for 10 years because it just feels like it acknowledges so much of this, of this nature of what Christ is calling us to, and what the congregation can do, what the presbytery can do in order to equip us for larger, more expansive, wider cultural complexity.
Thanks, Molly. And the thing that I want to sort of highlight too, I think, is something that you said really early on, that the reason why we engage in this racial equity piece is not so we can be good people, but so that we can really build kingdom together and to build a wider we. And I think sometimes that piece, the way that we state our goals matters, right? And so and that's a choice point, right? Is the goal, the stated goal, that we actually engage in racial equity pieces, or is the stated goal that we actually really expand who is part of the we within the presbytery, the congregation, right? So what's the long goal, and what's the piece that you're getting toward, right? And not the specifics of that. That can be a choice point that paints a different sort of vision. Welcome back, everyone. One of the things that we want to sort of highlight are some questions that could be aids or things, helpful questions to be thinking about as you continue to ponder your action plans. And that'll be part of the PowerPoint presentation that gets distributed to you all, and is on the screen right now. The other thing is we're going to go ahead and redrop into the chat the choice points handout, in case folks were not able to get that from yesterday's session. So Molly will drop that in the chat. But some quick insights that you'd like to share as we wind down our time together, coming out of your breakout rooms.
I'll just say, I think you need to think about your audience and who you want to reach and how is the best way to reach them. Like for us, we'll never have a super racially diverse church. There's just not enough diversity, and that's okay. But like one of the things I said is we have a university within our city who does have diversity. So could we reach out and bring, some different groups or clubs into our church to just talk about, so at least people are thinking, so if they travel or if they do whatever, they're more apt to think like, oh, these people might look different than me, but we're all the same in reality. So thinking about your audience and maybe what kind of steps they're willing to take, because you shouldn't, ask them to jump 2 miles ahead if they're not quite there. So sometimes maybe baby steps are better depending on where their comfort level is.
Sarah, thanks. Yeah, and absolutely, right? The developmental task for folks who might not even be aware that cultural difference is a thing is about raising awareness. And for folks who only see the differences, finding commonality is the developmental task there, right? So figuring out what that next step is and asking folks to just come along for that journey, really important. Thanks. Other insights just wanted to share?
Ashley shared a really great approach that her congregation is taking. I don't know if she would be willing to speak to it. I'm kind of putting you on the spot, Ashley, so sorry for that. But I thought it was a really interesting approach to it that I thought would be great to share if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in just outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and it's a rural community. So, and we are also an all-white congregation. And we started engaging in conversations intentionally after the death of George Floyd, and a call to action to join the 21-day racial equity challenge from Myers Park. So out of that came a social justice task force, and this congregation has never had any conversations around anything like this. So the task force started its work and really started to realize they needed to hear from the congregation what they were interested in and kind of their views. Like, okay, do you think social justice issues are something we should talk about in the church? Do you want to hear about this from the pulpit? Do you think it's an issue in Weatherford? What other social justice issues are important to you? And they named some, but then they also left, an option for people to fill in the blank. So out of that came a 12-month timeline addressing a different area of social interest each month. And so we have resources that we put out each month from different voices, and also have a speaker. We invite a speaker to come once a month to join us online to lead a conversation. And then we have conversations about the other resources. So we've talked about human trafficking, food insecurity, housing insecurity. This month is racism, so every month is something different. And the thing that they are really seeing and learning is how interwoven and interconnected really everything is. You cannot actually divide these issues out into separate months, which you all know. But I think it's something that if you've never had these conversations, you don't know that. You don't see the interconnectedness that exists in social issues and in life, and how that is important for us as people of faith to really address those things.
Thank you. Well, and we do have to wrap up so that folks can get into the next workshop and set up for that. But you'll notice that there is a survey that's actually being offered on in the chat, and so we ask you to participate in that. And Ashley, I love what you just said, right? That really all of these issues, we cannot separate this out, that building kingdom, and following where God is already in mission in the world and participating in that is all interrelated. And this is why this work is really important. And so as we leave, love for us to do this blessing and charge with one another. May the living God disturb us and trouble us.
May the Holy Spirit set an impossible task before us.
And dare us to meet it.
May the Holy One give us the strength to do our best.
And then, but only then,
may we be granted
Emmanuel's peace.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us for the last 3 sessions. God's peace and grace upon you as you go forth.